I have a feeling that Paul is going to be responding to this at some point.
Oh, why is that?
The title of the video is Demolishing Paulogia's Natural Explanation of Christianity. And that term actually, I think, is pretty accurate. Like it's going to be demolished.
Yikes. The end of my credibility, the end of my career, and probably my last day as a non-Christian. It's been a good run, but all good things must come to an end. If you want to see me demolished, you're in the right place. Welcome to Paulogia.
Paulogia, however you say his name, is...
I know, I ran into that as well, but I think it's just pronounced Paulogia.
Where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. Or today, taking a look at Christians who are taking a look at my claims. Recently, Capturing Christianity had a 2.5-hour live stream because...
I thought it would be fun to actually have Jimmy and Gavin kind of team up to respond to Paulogia. Recently released a video where he basically lays out, and I was actually kind of excited about this because he lays out his natural explanation of how Christianity started, why it's here.
Correct.
So this is actually, he's just reading an article that was posted on the Bart Ehrman website. So this is what it looks like on the Bart Ehrman website.
Also correct. I was asked to write a blog entry summarizing my minimal facts hypothesis. And as is very common in professional writing, I was given a word count limit as part of the assignment. In this case, a 2,000 word limit, though I cheated a little and snuck in 2,006 words. Reading the blog entry made a nice, concise 12-minute video outlining the position. Obviously, if my plan had been to ramble on for 2.5 hours, the scope would have been more detailed. That didn't stop the panel from criticizing the effort for not being what they wanted it to be.
Radical skepticism, but then not actually engaging with the source material to justify that skepticism is kind of how I would summarize my reaction to several of his events.
He does just like cherry pick the data. He likes this piece of data, and so he'll include that and try to explain that. But then when other data that exists contradicts what he's claiming, he just kind of ignores it or calls it unreliable. And he doesn't really give any arguments, at least in this video, for those conclusions.
I even went out of my way to make clear the scope of the article and video. Although the scholarly defense of each point could easily fill a full chapter in a book, the minimal witnesses hypothesis can be succinctly expressed as descriptions of 12 relatively uncontroversial naturalistic events, something even Cameron noted at one point.
Well, to be fair, he also does attempt to say at the beginning that a scholarly defense would require a book to be written for each one of these points. So maybe he has in mind that he has more arguments and stuff.
Yes, maybe I have in mind more arguments and stuff. But let's not let my initial disclaimer on the scope ruin the narrative that I have nothing backing it. And make no mistake, this panel was practically salivating and tripping over themselves to disparage me.
I was trying to think up a name that we should that's a little bit more accurate, and maybe something like minimal cherries hypothesis. Yeah, it's a very lazy and I think philosophically uninformed position to take on this as.
And it appears he's not even familiar with some of the sources that he's citing.
They were so focused on besmirchment and a full court press on less relevant details that they actually missed the entire point, and thereby actually offered virtually nothing at all by way of actual critique, wasting everyone's time. Unless the whole point was to dunk on the stupid atheist to the delight of a Christian audience who wants to be affirmed in what they already believe. Here was the assignment. Can you explain the existence of the church without a resurrection? Jimmy claims to understand the assignment.
I appreciate that Paulogia is trying to, provide a naturalistic explanation of the origin of Christianity that doesn't have an actual resurrection in it.
Now, I don't know if you know this, but the Bible says there was a resurrection. So any hypothesis that excludes a resurrection is going to, wait for it, contradict the Bible. The requirements of the assignment demand contradicting the Bible. So you know what is not a valid criticism of any naturalistic hypothesis? That it contradicts the Bible. Can you guess what the vast majority of the panel's complaints were? You got it, that it contradicted the Bible. Literally, by definition, no naturalistic explanation could exist without contradicting the Bible. If the panel doesn't want to entertain alternative hypotheses because they have some kind of presuppositional notion that the Bible cannot be wrong, fine. But then don't present yourself as if you're giving a naturalistic hypothesis any kind of serious consideration. You're not. I'm incredibly justified in labeling any such complaint. You need much more than it contradicts with the Bible to discredit a hypothesis that puts forth that the Bible is wrong. You can tell they didn't take this at all seriously, because their coverage of my point number 10 about my explanation for the Gospels went from 2 hours 4 minutes to 2 hours 9 minutes, which included the time it took me to read it. So less than 5 minutes out of the lengthy 150 minutes total. Only 3% of the video was spent on my reasons for why almost every complaint they had isn't actually a complaint if my hypothesis is correct. By way of comparison, they spent much more time discussing our point of agreement that Jesus was crucified than they do on any of the critique of gospel origins. This panel's response to my video is essentially the same as watching a video demonstrating a way to make delicious, gluten-free cookies, then spending 2.5 hours complaining that the recipe doesn't include flour. Newsflash, gluten-free cookies don't have flour. And naturalistic explanations for Christianity are going to contradict the Bible. That's the premise, not a rebuttal. And any such complaint demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of the assignment. While we're on the topic of misunderstanding the assignment, the panel seems to think that only someone with a naturalistic bias can entertain a naturalistic hypothetical.
He's beginning with false and closed-minded, anti-supernaturalistic philosophical assumption.
They were in such a race to discredit me that they paid no attention to me saying that I was still a Christian theist when I began considering such things. I believed in the supernatural. When I found my personal evangelical faith slipping away, a respected Christian mentor challenged me to answer one final question before closing the door. You don't have to be a closed-minded anti-supernaturalist to entertain explanations for thunder other than angry gods, or explanations for the Book of Mormon other than divine gold plates, or explanations of the Quran other than angel revelation. If you don't seriously consider hypotheticals for your beliefs, then I posit that you're not well justified in holding those beliefs. This is a minimum requirement for a rational thinker. If the panel is capable of entertaining a hypothetical for their religion, they didn't demonstrate it in this stream. Again, positing or evaluating a naturalistic hypothetical does not require starting from an anti-supernatural position. But while we're here, let's take a look at the critique they did offer. But it may not behoove prominent academics to focus on promoting specific pet theories. As Dr. Ehrman notes, any other scenario, no matter how unlikely, is more likely than the one in which a great miracle occurred.
So this is where he makes an anti-supernaturalistic philosophical assumption. He's basically retreading an argument that was popularized by David Hume.
They're complaining about Bart here, not me. This quote was included to juxtapose Bart's reasons to potentially not engage against my complete willingness to engage. They got distracted by this for quite a while, and even Cameron's audience grew impatient with the irrelevance and tried to keep them on track.
I'm actually looking at the comments, and someone is saying, I can see this whole video is going to be missing the point of Paul's video. And I don't think that's true. What we're doing right now is we're kind of looking at the very opening, which I was surprised to see this actually in the opening, but he does give this argument. I don't know that I would actually call it an argument, but he mentions that Bart Ehrman, at least, has this belief.
Yes, I was contrasting my position with Bart's, but by all means, continue on complaining about perceived philosophical bias instead of the points made.
So there's just a lot more work that needs to be done, I guess, is the kind of overall point. But let's go ahead and continue the video. Let's get into the 12 things that he says are what would explain Christianity.
The minimal witnesses hypothesis can be succinctly expressed as descriptions of 12 relatively uncontroversial naturalistic events. The panel took umbrage with my use of the phrase uncontroversial naturalistic events here.
This is not relatively uncontroversial.
Which directly contradicts what he said earlier, that these are relatively uncontroversial. But
and I found that really problematic, especially if these events are going to be cast as uncontroversial.
By this I mean the category of natural things that happen all the time. People die, people lie, people exaggerate, people change their mind, people assign meaning to things without justification. That kind of day-to-day stuff. I'm aware that it'll be shocking to some that I'm so bold as to break the news that mundane things can be more likely than their very special, fanciful stories about Jesus. That said, where it comes to any verifiable, extra-biblical historical claims I'm making in the sentences in bold, I'm standing solidly in mainstream scholarship, more so than the faith-committed panel. My plain text, plausible elaborations to the main points in bold can be speculative, which is why I label it as such, and attempted to ensure that it is not load-bearing for the hypothesis to stand. I get that if the modest statement, the Bible may not be 100% accurate, is controversial to you, you're gonna have a problem with just life in general. In the early 1st century, among the apocalyptic preachers active in Judea, was one Jesus of Nazareth. For the sake of this discussion, we're assuming Jesus was a historical figure.
I'll go first because I don't have a lot to say on this one. I think we can all sort of basically agree on this so far as it goes. None of us are going to deny that Jesus existed and that he preached and that some of his teaching was of an apocalyptic nature.
In this case, it's truly non-controversial. I mean, as Christian scholars don't have a problem with this. Jesus did have apocalyptic teachings, but this does nothing to undermine the resurrection.
It's not meant to.
That was kind of my thought too, as I was starting this video, was that this first one, it also seemed a little bit irrelevant in terms of explaining how Christianity began. But let's continue.
You are aware that allowing that to some watching this video, Jesus exists as a historical figure, is the most highly controversial thing I say, right? Take the win, panel. Relax. 2. This Jesus said or did controversial things which led to his crucifixion on a cross, a common practice at the time. While the infraction could have been anything, actions ascribed to Jesus, such as disturbing the peace in the temple or challenging Roman authority by claiming to be the Messiah or King of the Jews, would have been sufficient to warrant the death penalty under Roman rule.
Yeah, it was interesting that he mentioned events that occurred in the Gospels, but he obviously discounts those later on.
Perhaps you didn't notice that I did discount them here. I didn't say they happened. I just acknowledged that they would be sufficient.
It's stated in a way that there's nothing that is said here that, strictly speaking, I would disagree with.
Cool.
But it doesn't go far enough, I would say, because there's this, again, a skepticism that I don't think is being justified.
You are aware that everyone upset with me for saying Jesus exists are still mad here. And now I've added about 2 billion Muslims into the disagree column by acknowledging that Jesus probably actually died.
Jesus said or did controversial things. Well, that could be anything.
Yes, it could be. You're going to complain later that I'm being too specific, but now I'm too vague. I'm not the one pretending to know exactly what Jesus said or did here. I also didn't say that the Bible is false about what he said or did. Perhaps you're upset that the specifics about what Jesus said or did isn't actually even a factor here. This is going to be a theme, but if you can't be skeptical enough to, even for the sake of discussion, temporarily imagine that maybe not every word of the Bible is accurate, then evaluating hypotheticals isn't for you.
Now, Bart Ehrman says the Son of Man isn't Jesus, which I think is a really eccentric view.
They go on about our point of non-disagreement for several minutes. If you care about the panel's, irrelevant to this discussion, abundant confidence in each of the New Testament's red letters, feel free to check that out.
Even though Paulogia is fundamentally correct on this point, which is not controversial, it still doesn't do anything to undermine the resurrection.
Not meant to. Apparently no credit for acknowledging facts. The resting place of Jesus' body was unknown to his followers.
Well, as you guys can see, this is very, very controversial.
They spent over 30 minutes of the total video on this point about burial. Not that I blame them. This is definitely the most nuanced point to make in either direction. And if I ever write the book, this will be by far the longest chapter, like maybe almost 10,000 words just for this part.
Going to be looking at these sources that he's citing here in defense of this third claim. So just buckle up. We're just going to continue watching and then we'll look at the sources.
Buckle up. Buckle up, everybody. Come on. Cameron's been waiting all week for this. He's like a kid on Christmas morning. He's got some gotchas ready, and I am going down. It's half hour into the stream, and he can finally blurt out the good stuff. Oh man, it's going to be so great. It's almost time. Cameron and the panel are going to destroy Paulogia so good. They can't just do it. They got to hype it up like they're professional wrestlers.
I was actually kind of excited about this because as we dug deeper and deeper, we found some really interesting things. So we'll just put it that way. There's a lot of cherry picking going on in the data. And I think you guys, as you're watching, you'll be able to see that as well. 11 days ago, 42,000 views, which seems to me actually kind of on the low end for the amount of views that his videos normally get. I don't want to spoil anything too soon, but we will start to look at some of these sources that he cites, and we found some problems with those. I'll put it that way. The title of the video is Demolishing Paulogia's Natural Explanation of Christianity. And that term actually, I think, is pretty accurate. Like it's going to be demolished. Like I said, it's kind of exciting to me.
All the best scholars pound their chests and open with smack talk first. That's how you know they're good at being scholars. Yeah. Though to be fair, maybe he learned some braggadocious, blustery style from overly confident resurrection scholar Gary Habermas.
He was actually responding to Gary Habermas. That's why you see Gary Habermas in the thumbnail of this video.
It's a whole vibe from the apologetics camp, but I'm here for it. Destroy me, and I'll change my mind.
I was just going to say, what we're about to do is look in detail at the sources that he cites here, because that's a big problem.
We got a big problem.
Yeah, you got a big problem.
We got a big problem. Big.
It's a big problem, Guy. It's a massive problem.
So the idea that the resting place of Jesus' body was unknown to his followers is patently false.
See, that's just patently false.
That is false.
That is false.
False.
Wicked, crazy, false.
We get it. I suck. Can we start looking at my actual statements yet?
Let's hear what he has to say, though.
But the crucial question is who disposed of it? If the Romans were responsible, the body would have been left on the cross, possibly to be eaten by animals, as this humiliation was considered part of the punishment.
Now, this is possibly the most mundane historical claim I've ever made on my channel. I'm unaware of any historian, be they Christian, Muslim, Jewish, secular, doesn't matter, that thinks that Romans disposed of crucifixion victims in marked graves that could be identified later.
But I would concede, and many would, that that's what happened to most people.
It is true that was typically the typical practice of the Romans to do that.
Remember, we're starting with what the Romans would have done if they had disposed of the body. I'm unaware of any historian who disputes my modest contention here. But Jimmy has something to say.
But he tries to cite various sources. The first one, his footnote 10, he says Quintilian Declamations 274. And this is in support of the idea that bodies were left on the cross as part of the humiliation of the punishment. Well, okay, so Quintilian was a first century writer, but he is not regarded as the author of the Declamations.
Boom! Gotcha!
I mean, okay. But Loeb Classics publishes it as Quintilian, the Lesser Declamations, so you'll forgive me if I don't go into an authorship debate in the footnotes of a word count constrained blog entry. But it's good to get some undermining nitpicks in to poison the well against my credibility.
But what it's talking about is a tyrant who's been struck by lightning, because there was a previous custom of if someone gets struck by lightning, you bury him where he got struck. And the question was, well, if a tyrant, a bad guy, gets struck by lightning, in a city, should you bury him right there in a city where his tomb is going to become prominent and remembered? And so that's the issue that's being debated. It's about tyrants and how tyrants die. It is not about Jesus. This is irrelevant to Jesus's case.
Gotcha!
Okay, Jimmy, you said your piece. You didn't quote the passage or put it on screen. You just gave us your own Wikipedia narrative about the context. Now let's go back and look at what I said and wrote, and what the footnote is supposed to validate. For Romans, humiliation was considered part of the punishment. Does the passage that I cite affirm that Romans considered humiliation to be part of punishment? Here's the passage in Latin. You can look up the minor declamations ascribed to Quintilian yourself on archive.org, or your library, or wherever you like. Here's how Google Translate translates it. It's understandably a little choppy, so let's go with the translation used by Christian scholar Dale Allison. Whenever we crucify the condemned, the most crowded roads are chosen, where the most people can see and be moved by this terror. For the penalties relate not so much to retribution as to their exemplary effect. Does this establish that Romans' attitudes toward crucifixion is that the public display is part of why they crucify people? I'd say it does. Your mileage may vary. Was this said in the context of a speech about someone struck by lightning? Yes. Was this specific statement about general attitudes about people struck by lightning? No. It's a comparison to crucifixion victims. Sometimes speeches about one thing can contain facts about another thing. Was this written after Jesus' death? Yes, it was. Though it's dated before, some people date the Gospel of John. Do we have reason to think this attitude arose after Jesus' death? No. Do we have reason to think this reflects a long-standing Roman tradition? Yes. For example, around 10 BC, philosophy-minded poet Horace assumes that it's common knowledge in his audience that the fate of those guilty of murder is to feed the carrion crows on the cross. In the macabre tale of Maiden of Ephesus, in Petronius' Satyricon, written in the 1st century, a guard and a widow engaged in a 3-day sexual tryst. All the while, the bodies of crucified thieves remained hanging on display. In the 1st century BC, Antigonius took the body of his rival and maltreated it for 3 days. Then, as the corpse began to decay, he threw it out unburied. And for the crimes of stealing against the temple of Proserpine, and for the record, I've probably pronounced all of these names wrong since I read rather than listen, a list of gruesome tortures is capped with death in a cruel manner, forbidding them to be buried. So if you don't like my first quote, Are these good enough for the esteemed panel to establish something as mundane as Rome's general attitude? If they know of historians who disagree on this point, can they let the rest of us know? To Jimmy's other bizarre complaint, did I ever say that this passage is about Jesus? No. I indicated that it supports my claim about Roman attitudes about crucifixion. Did I insist that the Romans were the ones who buried Jesus? No, I did not. I said, what would happen if the Romans were the ones in charge of Jesus' body? To the best of my knowledge, no historian seriously disputes that's probably how Romans would have handled it.
If a Judean religious exemption existed, despite explicit records to the contrary regarding Jesus' case of treason, the responsibility would have fallen to the family to successfully petition those in power.
Before we delve into the complaints here, let's just be clear that this sentence is granting a religious exemption for the sake of discussion. That there was a religious exemption is the position of this panel. I am granting the panel's conclusion here. Let's not lose sight of that as the accusations fly. My case allows for a religious exemption. I do have a parenthetical that merely notes that there is an explicit record exempting treason from general allowance. I don't say it makes the general allowance false, because in fact I'm granting the general allowance for the sake of discussion, whether the exemption to the exemption holds in Jesus' case or not. We're all clear, right? I'm absolutely granting the panel's position. My case in no way needs this parenthetical to hold. It's merely a side comment that I thought was interesting. We're clear? Okay. What complaint does Jimmy have?
Paulogia then goes on to cite another source, which is in his footnote 11. He cites Scott, who is a modern author-editor, The Civil Law, and then he gives a citation of 48.21.1. Well,
let me actually go down and jump to that. Yeah, Scott Civil Law 48.21.1. Okay.
Yeah. So, well, that's a typo, because if you look in the civil law, this is a law code that was compiled under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD. And if you look at that section, it has nothing to do with any of this. What does is a neighboring section, which is 48.24.1. And so we've got at least a typo here. Which raises questions, and his misuse of this source raises questions in my mind about, did Paulogia even look this up?
Ha! Gotcha.
So some of that is an artifact of my citation software, Zotero, and how it ends up adapting to different citation formats, APA versus Chicago, for example. Or this is Chicago Casual, which is what Bart uses for his blog entries, so I followed suit. Here's the full citation, as used in my pre-existing notes document on the topic of Jesus' burial, from which this blog entry was summarized. This isn't published yet, so you would have to take my word that this document has been around since mid-2023. Believe me or don't. As you can see, Samuel Parsons Scott is the translator and editor of the edition that I've been referencing for my research on this matter, so Zotero prioritized that for whatever reason. So you can see in my main document, I am referencing 48.24.1, and then later another reference to 48.24.3. So yeah, 21 in my blog instead of 24 is a typo. Thank you for catching that. I definitely own that error of a single digit and will ask the blog team to correct it when they can. It sucks because this typo seems to be the main takeaway of Cameron's fans, and it's proving to be an excuse for them to ignore everything else. Alas, I am a human person. That said, Jimmy thinks this typo raises questions of whether I even looked this up. He's free to draw whatever conclusion he wants, of course. From my perspective, this panel seems overly motivated by their unmitigated delight in general besmirchment and well-poisoning against me. But perhaps I'm too close to this, and I'm being the uncharitable one here. I'll let you decide. Let me know in the comments.
The bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused their relatives, and the divine Augustus, in the 10th book on his life, said that this rule had been observed. So note that in the time of the divine Augustus, which was the end of the 1st century BC up to AD 14, this was the rule. If the relatives ask for the body, you give it to them. At present, so now Ulpianus is talking about his own time, and Ulpianus lived between 170 and 233 AD. So this is like 2 centuries after Jesus' time. There is a new rule. At present, the bodies of those who have been punished are only buried when this has been requested and permission granted, and sometimes it is not permitted, especially where persons who have been convicted of high treason. So what Ulpianus is saying, that the rule in Augustus's time, which is effectively Jesus's time, was if the the relatives ask for the body, you give it to them. By Ulpianus's time, 2 centuries later, it was a little bit more restrictive than that. Sometimes they wouldn't give the body back in cases of treason, but only sometimes.
Be precise. It says sometimes they won't give it back, but especially don't give it back when it's treason.
It illustrates for us how Paulogia is misusing this source.
Gotcha.
This passage of the Digest has been part of a back-and-forth scholar debate between Craig Evans and Bart Ehrman. Here's Bart's comment on the passage. It is drawn from the summary of Roman law known as the Digesta. Craig doesn't tell his readers that this is the compilation of legal opinions made under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE, that is, 500 years after the death of Jesus. But it may not matter. The Digest is citing earlier rulings, in this particular case, a 3rd century author who claims to be quoting a 1st century source. Again, Craig doesn't tell us this somewhat complicated history of transmission, and so there's a good chance that in fact this ruling did apply in the 1st century. I'll grant this was written after Jesus, but does what follows after the translation yields as a semicolon apply to the initial 1st century clause or to the author's day clause, or both? It is ambiguous, and we cannot be dogmatic about it, no matter what burial apologist Craig Evans asserts.
And you're right, the way this code works is it's a collection of different legal traditions that then have to be harmonized and applied by the judges.
My conscience is clear that I'm using the passage in good faith and in a manner consistent with actual scholarly historians. I wouldn't and wasn't being dogmatic about the passage being a counter gotcha. All that I said in a parenthetical is that there is a clear record of a different policy for treason. This is a clear record of a different policy for treason, and at least arguably within a 1st century policy context. But let me be charitable for the moment, and say for the sake of this discussion, that this Digesta passage was definitely not in effect in the 1st century, that I was completely wrong to bring it up, and I should absolutely hang my head in shame. What would change about my blog or video by removing this parenthetical completely? It would read, if a Judean religious exemption existed, the responsibility would have fallen to the family. Oh look, nothing at all has changed. I'm still granting the possibility of the exact religious exemption the panel is advocating for in exactly the same way I was all along. This was a tempest in a teapot about a point I was granting all along.
Well, if Caesar Augustus's policy was being followed, as we have evidence it was from Josephus and Philo and others, as well as archaeological evidence with dozens and perhaps more than 100 crucifixion nails found in Jewish tombs in the Jerusalem area, then Mary wouldn't have had any problems securing the body.
As fun as it might be to get into every single word of the panel's objections, like nails in tombs being more likely tied to superstitious and ritualistic inclusion in a manner evidenced across the empire, rather than proposing that an obsessively regulated culture were strangely and unnecessarily tossing the instrument of foreign torture in with the religiously significant curated ossuaries like it was a garbage pail. I'm going to jump ahead on this one, because despite protestations, the panel ultimately isn't advocating that Jesus' family claimed his body, so we can save details on this side quest hypothetical for another video if anyone is interested.
Let's continue on with the next sentence.
In the absence of family, the priesthood would have taken charge. However, Jewish law mandated that criminals be left in separate designated graveyards of the condemned in a dishonorable and secretive manner. And here he quotes Josephus. The Antiquity. The Antiquities of the Jews for section 202, which I actually have pulled up here. There we go.
So he's right that the priesthood, which was also in charge of the ritual purity of Jerusalem, could intervene. And Evans points out, and that's exactly what happened. The priesthood and the ruling authorities, the Sanhedrin, could intervene.
So far, so good.
And we know that Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin.
Nope. Off the rails. That isn't something we know. It's not part of Habermas's minimal facts. It's not broadly accepted by secular historians. That claim is both and, in the view of myself and scholars, lending to the suspicion of a purely literary plot point, which we'll get into.
What Paulogia is arguing, though, is that according to Josephus, that criminals had to be placed in separate designated graveyards of the condemned in a dishonorable and secretive manner. And that is not what Josephus says. What Josephus says, and here he's summarizing the law as it came from Moses. He's not directly quoting Moses, but he is summarizing the law, which reflects at least approximately what the general practice was in his day. But because it's a summary, it means it doesn't go into all the details of how it was actually applied. But what he says is, let one who blasphemes be stoned and hanged for a day. Let him be buried without honor and in obscurity. There is nothing here about separate graveyards for criminals.
How about something like, gotcha?
That's correct. The footnote after the phrase dishonorable and secretive was meant to help bolster the dishonorable and secretive part. I didn't know that I need to back up the common knowledge, separate criminal grave part. I assumed that Jimmy would be aware of the established Jewish custom on this. The following are from rabbinic compilations preserving older oral traditions largely considered in effect during the Second Temple period. The primary text, Sanhedrin Mishnah 6.5, after the executed transgressor is taken down, he is buried, and they would not bury him in his ancestral burial plot. Rather, 2 graveyards were established for the burial of those executed by the court. Repeated in Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 46a, after the executed transgressor is taken down, he is buried, and they would not bury him in his ancestral burial plot. Rather, 2 graveyards were established for the burial of those executed by the court. Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 47a, the Mishnah teaches that they would not bury the executed transgressor in his ancestral burial plot, but rather in one of 2 special graveyards set aside for those executed by the court. Tosefta Sanhedrin 9.8 says, criminals were not buried in their fathers' burying places, but 2 burial places were prepared by the court. And, as if anticipating any special pleading the panel may have for Jesus, it adds, even if the criminal were the King of Kings, he could not be buried in the burying place of his fathers, but only in that prepared by the court. Good enough?
For it to be otherwise would require the same authorities who condemned Jesus to honor him mere hours later, a notion nearly as implausible as a resurrection. Let me just reiterate that.
That's nuts.
That's nuts.
That's nuts. Our earliest gospel, Mark 14:58. The whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. Whole means all. Next chapter, Mark 15:43. Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of that council, intervened to keep Jesus out of the criminal graveyard. I'd say I'm describing it well, and this disconnect was obviously noted by others back in the 1st century. When Matthew adapted this story from Mark, he took Joseph off the council, possibly in order to avoid this problem. When Luke adapted this story from Mark, he added in a line about Joseph actually being a good man who dissented from the decision, even though the earlier source indicated it was unanimous, and John decides to promote Joseph to full disciple status. If Mark's version were problem-free in the 1st century, the other 3 gospel authors wouldn't have had to fix it in 3 different ways.
And then again, he's cherry-picking the data. He's ignoring the traditions that mention Joseph of Arimathea.
I'm not ignoring them. You know full well that in point 10, I directly deal with the Gospels and the traditions held within. They're literary creations containing some codification of developed legends. Of all the human characters in the New Testament, I think Joseph of Arimathea is one of the most obviously invented. Ahistorical. I made Joseph of Arimathea myther. I didn't start this way, but the more I research, the less likely he seems. To go through my who disposed of him scenarios again, which the panel didn't actually refute or even really dispute, despite all this source protestation. If the Romans, unremembered location, Jesus' family didn't claim him, I say that because it seems clear they didn't have financial, logistical, or political clout. The panel would say this because of the Bible. Either way, no family. So if the Jewish leadership, Jesus goes into the criminal's graveyard. If you're any random Jewish man being crucified in 33 AD, you're 99% likely to be disposed of by the Romans, your family, or the Sanhedrin. Why I shouldn't prefer the 99% scenario is beyond me, but let me throw it to renowned Christian scholar and author of the most universally respected resurrection book around, Dr. Dale Allison. Receiving a dishonorable burial, or no burial at all, would have put Jesus in disreputable company. One would understand then if his followers found in this unedifying fact motivation to invent a legend or Haggadic tale purporting otherwise. To get Jesus out of a ditch or out of the criminal's graveyard, they needed Jesus to have a powerful friend who also held sway with his enemies. In a full-length video about Joseph of Arimathea, we'd talk about his escalating gospel depictions, which Allison admits strongly suggest a proclivity toward the legendary. Joseph's perfect mapping to a literary catalytic character, one who enters the scene with the exact thing needed to move the plot along, and then disappearing forever. The unhistorical Moses Haggadah observations, the wacky legends landing Joseph in both Indiana Jones and Monty Python movies, and so on and so on. Concluding that traditions are legendary rather than historical isn't the same as ignoring the traditions, no matter how much this panel whines about it. As scholar John Dominic Crossan says, with regard to the body of Jesus, by Easter Sunday morning, those who cared did not know where it was, and those who knew did not care.
Mark is establishing a chain of custody for Jesus' body. He says these named women saw where he was buried. And the only reason to say that is to establish a chain of custody for the body.
The only reason? I consider this an abject failure of Jimmy's reasoning skills, that he is unaware that people who invent stories invent details to make the story seem more realistic. There's a defendant in Manhattan who would love to have Jimmy on his jury.
Jesus had 12 core disciples that traveled around with him. That is non-controversial. It is reported in the Gospels and elsewhere in the New Testament that they went to Jerusalem with him when he was crucified, and so they would have known what was happening with his body.
Why would they have known? Because you say so? Even your books don't say so. None of the Gospels mentions the name of any of the 12 as being present when Jesus was killed, or going to the burial after party. This isn't even for the Bible tells me so. This is speculation.
Speculating.
This is speculating, speculator, or
Speculative possibilities.
Now, a huge part of history is speculation. We're both putting forth hypotheses, but I'm not the one pretending that my speculation is data.
What Paulogia seems to be envisioning is Jesus' followers decades later didn't know what happened to his body for reals.
That is correct. Just like most crucifixion victim locations were unknown weeks later, let alone decades. That you don't understand that yours is the most unusual scenario is unsettling.
But his immediate followers certainly would have known, and they would have passed on that memory to his later followers.
Other than your say-so, why would they have? This isn't data to be explained.
We have this reported in all four of the Gospels. They are not all by the same author. They represent different traditions, with the Synoptic tradition being one and the Johannine tradition being another.
Matthew and Luke copied Mark. That's not multiple attestation, and modern scholarship acknowledges that John knew of and likely used Mark. This is collusion, not corroboration. Again, that defendant in Manhattan would love to have you on his jury.
In Acts 13, it's also attested that the Sanhedrin as a whole, which is not inconsistent with some members of the Sanhedrin.
Some members? I find one member of the Sanhedrin implausible, but now I'm supposed to imagine there were several of them? Your book says the whole Sanhedrin wanted him dead, and would have been legally obligated to put him in the criminal's graveyard, even if he was king of kings. So this likely earlier tradition of multiple members being involved points directly to a dishonorable and forgotten location.
A lot of critical scholars take this tradition very seriously.
If a lot of critical scholars took the Joseph of Arimathea tradition seriously, it would be one of Gary's minimal facts. But it is not.
So then, the problem with this is if you just make that up, or if Joseph of Arimathea didn't exist, or if he existed and he was a member of the Sanhedrin, but he didn't have anything to do with the burial of Jesus, or if he existed, but he wasn't a member of the Sanhedrin, or there's some kind of error in these traditions, people can point that out. It's a falsifiable claim.
It's interesting that you say that, because the Gospel of Nicodemus included a story that Joseph of Arimathea was imprisoned immediately after Jesus' burial, and spoke to no one for many years, and was then whisked away to Britain, according to later stories. By Gavin's logic, why would people invent stories to explain why no one was able to confirm the details of Joseph of Arimathea if he was, in fact, walking around Jerusalem, available to talk to the people about his Jesus tomb adventures? It's a falsifiable claim, isn't it? This is the earliest attestation of what Joseph was up to, so it must be true. Right, panelists? That's how this works.
Paulogia, by my lights, just kind of skirts around that. He doesn't really give a counter argument. And I found that really problematic, especially if these events are going to be cast as uncontroversial.
Yes, I should have included a 10,000-word Joseph of Arimathea essay in the middle of my maximum 2,000-word summary. Or at least I should have warned that it was a summary.
Although the scholarly defense of each point could easily fill a full chapter in a book, the minimal witnesses hypothesis can be succinctly expressed.
Oh, right. I did.
Yeah, I would say two concerns with this point that I think make this just really, really a poor statement. First is the arbitrariness of the criteria. he mentions in the first sentence regular mentioning of Jesus' disciples after the ascension. To which I respond, well, why exclude the historical data prior to the ascension, like the Gospels and Acts chapter 1, where a lot of the disciples are mentioned? Does being before that event somehow change the historical status?
No, I'm pretty clear that I think the Gospels before and Acts and the forged letters afterward are all unreliable literary product containing legendary development. I'm just pointing out that even unreliable Acts gives us nothing to work with.
But my main thing on this is I just think even with that restriction that he gives of regular mentioning post-ascension, we simply do have a good historical attestation of other disciples of Christ. James, the brother of Jesus, would be one.
Which is why my point 6 is all about James. Point 4 is about Jesus' followers while he was alive. Gary Habermas and other evangelicals insist that James didn't become a follower until after Jesus was killed. If you disagree, you can take it up with Gary.
So he's trying to contract down the number of witnesses to the resurrection because that's necessary for his case. But to do that, he has to do both of these things. First, give an arbitrary limit of the allowable historical data.
If limiting myself to historical sources that historians consider reliable is arbitrary, then okay. Are you advocating that I should include unreliable sources?
There's good historical evidence that James, the brother of Jesus, existed, you can't just sort of exclude a figure like that from visibility and not get into the question of his existence.
It's my point 6. I don't see how giving James his own point is excluding him.
So I think this is, by my lights, the most problematic one.
The most problematic because I want to use only reliable sources, and because you'd have preferred James to be inaccurately placed in point 4 rather than point 6. Not much of a criticism from Gavin then. I'm sure Jimmy has more to say.
And he says, despite self-serving and often fanciful church traditions arising centuries later, only Peter and John of the 12 are regularly mentioned after the events of Jesus' ascension. Okay, that's in the book of Acts.
The ascension is first mentioned in Luke, not Acts.
So notice he's cherry-picking the book of Acts when it supports his case.
Where have I used Acts anywhere to support my case? Do you think that my naturalistic explanation of Christianity includes an ascension to heaven?
He cites it, but when it doesn't support his case, like Jesus had conversations with Peter and the other 12 for 40 days.
It's unreliable history.
Yeah, he dismisses
It's
that.
reliable when he needs it, unreliable when it contradicts what he's claiming.
To be clear, while I think Acts is the product of a researcher capable of injecting points of verisimilitude into the fiction, I don't think it generally reflects actual events. If you have examples of me considering it to be reliable, call me out. But this clearly isn't one of those times.
He then says, in his comprehensive study, Sean McDowell acknowledges that Peter is the sole member of the 12 for whom there is high confidence of martyrdom. Okay, here's the thing. If you look in his citation 15, he does cite Sean McDowell's Fate of the Apostles, but he gives us no quotation from the Fate of the Apostles where Sean McDowell says that, and he gives us no page number. And that's because Sean McDowell doesn't say that.
Gotcha.
And since Paulogia didn't give us a page number, I will. It's page 192 if you want to look it up. Sean McDowell says, the burden of proof is thus on those who would doubt the early, consistent, and reliable testimony that James, the son of Zebedee, was the first apostolic martyr. So Paulogia is misrepresenting McDowell here.
Gotcha.
Okay, cool. Now let's listen to the author, Sean McDowell himself, talking about James, son of Zebedee.
I probably would assess James, the son of Zebedee, one notch down. And that's because we have one good source for James in the book of Acts. But I probably put that a little higher than it should be given one source. That's one I would revisit.
Did I misrepresent Sean? Notice that in this clip, Sean also affirms the principle that something found only in the book of Acts should be considered less reliable.
It is not simply Peter that we have good evidence for martyrdom of. And we also have, although he doesn't mention it, good evidence for Paul's martyrdom as well.
That's all in my point 11. Why does this panel keep insinuating I'm cherry-picking by excluding data that I've explicitly included?
Martyrdom is just the most extreme form of persecution. But if you stick to your story with lesser forms of persecution, then we still have evidence that, okay, these people are sticking with their story.
Where, Jimmy? Where do you have evidence that James, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, or Judas son of James were sticking to their story? And don't say Acts, because it's not in there.
And we have abundant evidence, particularly from Acts, but also elsewhere, including Paul's epistles, that there was persecution of the early Christian community, including the 12.
Where is your reliable evidence that James, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, or Judas son of James were part of the early Christian community being persecuted?
So we have evidence, even if it's not always martyrdom, that they are sticking to their story despite the fact they're facing adversity.
This is what I've been asking for years now, and no one has an answer. Where is your reliable evidence that James, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, or Judas son of James stuck to their story? Does anyone have this? Anyone at all? Or are Christians like Jimmy just imagining this must be the case, then asserting it as true based on speculation?
While potential causes are innumerable, a post-bereavement hallucinatory experience involving sensory perceptions of a deceased loved one is a likely cause of Peter's mistaken belief, estimated to affect 30 to 60% of bereaved individuals during their grieving process.
So he's right.
Yay, I'm right about something.
After a loved one dies, people often, not necessarily when they're grieving, but they often do report having an after-death communication. These after-death communications are known as ADCs, with the departed loved one.
Oh, no. Post-bereavement death hallucinations aren't after-death communication. ADC is ghosts. I know you believe in ghosts, Jimmy, but no naturalistic explanation for anything is going to include really real ghosts.
That's not consistent, especially the idea this was a grief-induced perception on Peter's part does not fit with the evidence. The reports of the resurrection are not expected.
The level to which Peter may or may not have been primed for this can be debated another time. But people who experience PBHEs don't tend to be expecting them. Expectation is not a prerequisite or even mentioned as a factor in the research. Try again.
For a period, Peter thought he was seeing Jesus as a ghost. But then Jesus takes the initiative. This is recorded, for example, in Luke 24. It's also reflected in John 21. Jesus makes a point of having and John 20, he makes a point of having the disciples touch him and feel him. And he says, see my hands, see my feet, that it is I myself, handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones as you see that I have.
Or, and hear me out, that story didn't actually happen. It's a legend that emerged as a polemic and grew to answer the objections that maybe Peter just saw a ghost.
He also eats in front of them, specifically broiled fish, both in Luke and in John 21. So Jesus did things to falsify the I'm just a ghost hypothesis.
Or maybe the story of post-death Jesus eating fish also didn't actually happen.
None of which Paulogia interacts with.
Point 10. Man, this panel just really wants to plant that seed that I'm ignoring things.
And a question that I had when I interviewed some scholars a little bit while back on this is, of the people that have these sorts of post-bereavement hallucinatory experiences, how many of them go on to believe that their deceased loved one has risen from the dead or is alive again?
Gotcha.
Yeah. I can't remember what they said in response to that.
First, they don't know of anyone because that's not yet a question the researchers have asked. Maybe the answer is dozens or hundreds or thousands. More importantly, study of grief hallucinations began in the late 1960s. People living after the first moon landing have an entirely different worldview than people living in a time when they were sacrificing animals in an attempt to control the weather. That said, thousands of people claim to have seen Elvis alive after his passing in 1977, some of which very plausibly could have been grief hallucinations. So this is an objection from silence.
So in Paulogia's view, Peter is patient zero. He's the source of the contagion.
Yes, he's the source of it. But no one else besides Paul had anything remotely like this.
Yes, you actually get it. Great news.
And so some people get around that, like Paul, by saying, well, there weren't groups of people that were having these appearances of Jesus or experiences. There was one person who then spread it to other people.
Correct. Exactly. Group experiences are not a fact to be explained. Gary Habermas doesn't include it as a fact, and I certainly don't think it's a fact.
Okay, almost every scholar agrees that what I'm about to show you in 1 Corinthians 15 dates back to within months of Jesus' resurrection.
Though I don't care if you date it right back to Easter Sunday. Cameron's assertion about scholarship here is false.
And it had to exist by AD 53 because that's when 1 Corinthians was written.
Correct. It predates the book it was written in. That's what we know.
So this is not decades later. This is within 20 years.
Is 20 years not decades?
Here's why we're saying that he's cherry picking the data. Okay, this is some of the best material we've got in the New Testament.
I agree that it's some of the best material you've got in the New Testament. I really wouldn't brag about that. It's at best a third-hand repetition of a catchy meme of unknown origin. This is your best.
So this is some of the earliest material that we have that Paul is just completely ignoring. Like, he's not addressing it. He's not even trying to say that it's unreliable.
Lest it was somehow unclear, I'm definitely trying to say it's unreliable.
Which is I think, just a scholarly bonkers view, honestly.
You are bonkers.
Yes, I've put myself into such scholarly bonkers company as Dale Allison, Gerd Ludemann, Bart Ehrman, and virtually every non-Christian scholar on earth. I'll let them know that Cameron says they're bonkers. Does this creed reliably reflect early Jesus movement beliefs? Probably. Does it reliably reflect real events that really happened? Probably not.
Okay, this is some of the stuff that almost everybody agrees about. That he appeared to all of these different people.
If everyone agreed to this, Gary Habermas would include it in his minimal facts. But it is not included in the minimal facts. It is not widely agreed to. Cameron is just wrong here.
To say that only Peter was the only one who had an appearance contradicts some of the best source material that we have on this subject.
Correct. And your admission that this is the best you've got, while simultaneously not reaching Gary's fact threshold, serves only to undermine the resurrection case further.
And Paul is just ignoring it.
Yeah. The way I'd put it is, this is the earliest, most indisputable record of claiming resurrection appearances.
I don't dispute that it claims resurrection appearances. That those claims are accurate is highly disputed by top people for thousands of years. Cameron might need to get out of his echo chamber a little.
It flatly contradicts Paulogia's Peter is patient zero hypothesis. So Paulogia's hypothesis is contradicted by the earliest, most undoubted evidence that we have regarding Christian claims for resurrection appearances.
The creed contains the phrase that he was raised on the third day. It is literally impossible to posit a naturalistic alternative without contradicting this passage. To contradict this passage is an absolute requirement for any possible naturalistic alternative. What the panel is unwilling to entertain is that this passage could be wrong, and if Christianity must be true, because this specific passage simply cannot be wrong for reasons, we're solidly in the land of...
This does major damage to his theory that Peter just had a hallucination and then spread the idea.
I'm not sure how this panel doesn't see that they're begging the question.
But yeah, it's like he just, like, at verse 5, he's like, he sees that Peter saw Jesus, and then he's like, okay, well, I'm good. I'll stop there. I'm gonna stop reading.
Where did I ever say that this creed is the source that convinces me that Peter saw something? It absolutely is not.
The rest of it, just like, we'll just ignore the rest of this.
To be clear, I can think this is a fictional saying, even if it happens to have elements in it that I would accept. Should I suggest that Cameron is cherry-picking Humpty Dumpty if he acknowledges that horses exist?
This is really weird. He says James, the brother of Jesus, became part of Peter's Jesus movement. Well, okay, that's true.
Nice.
Perhaps also one of the disciples named John. Well, here we're clearly talking about John, son of Zebedee. So perhaps John, son of Zebedee, joined Peter's Jesus movement after the resurrection? That makes no sense. I mean, even unbelieving secular scholars will acknowledge John, son of Zebedee, was one of Jesus's followers during his ministry. He was, in fact, one of the core 4 disciples. So Paulogia is cherry-picking hard here.
It doesn't matter that John followed Jesus while he was alive. Peter's movement didn't start until after Jesus died. So John, definitionally, couldn't join the movement until it exists. That's just how time works. Evidence suggests that up to 10 of the 12 didn't join the new movement. There was no automatic transfer of membership.
He then says, Paul mentions meeting James, Peter, and John in Jerusalem, so we know they were all involved in the church. Yeah. We don't know what any of these men believed about resurrected Jesus. Wait, on your theory, didn't Peter, Paulogia, on your theory, didn't Peter believe Jesus was resurrected? He was one of those men you just named.
That's an uncareful reading, Jimmy. I accept that James, Peter, and John may have acknowledged a resurrected Jesus. What I'm saying is, we don't have any details beyond that general acknowledgement. As I said, we don't know what these men believed about resurrected Jesus. For example, did they think risen Jesus ate fish? We don't know. What kind of vision was Peter professing? We don't know. Did James or John ever tell a single human that they personally saw risen Jesus for themselves? We don't know.
I was just looking at 1 Corinthians 3, which mentions the appearances, and then the maximalists will say, well, they don't specify what those experiences were like, and that's kind of what Paul is picking up on here, is that it doesn't explain in those verses, but I mean, the verses at least mention that they were appeared to, but it doesn't say what types of experiences they've got.
Correct.
But in the Gospels themselves, if you want to make a maximalist case or argue that the Gospels are reliable history, then you've got additional sources to contend with that give us the detailed information about what these men would have believed.
If you want to argue that Jesus rose because the supernatural elements of the Gospels must be reliable, then your case is...
He tries to bolster his case in footnote 17. He says, scholarly argument and critical consensus conclude that the New Testament books attributed to James, Peter, and John were unlikely to have been written by them, though this case is outside the scope of a short blog entry. Even so, these letters hold no eyewitness details relevant to a resurrection case. Okay, well, some scholars, not a critical consensus, unless you restrict who you consider a critical scholars to just those who agree with your viewpoint.
Yes, I'm referring to scholars who haven't signed a statement of faith as part of their employment, promising to affirm that the Bible is completely true no matter what.
He says, even so, the letters hold no eyewitness details relevant to a resurrection case. Well, okay, they don't go into a lot of detail, but they do testify to belief in the resurrection.
Again, the claim is we don't know what they believed about the resurrection. But by all means, let's hear what you've got from the forged letters.
James, in the first verse of his letter, introduces himself as James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. So he believes Jesus is the Lord and Christ.
Believing Jesus is the Christ isn't synonymous with believing Jesus rose from the dead. Earlier, you were quite insistent that resurrection wasn't an expectation of a Messiah.
Peter, in the first verse of his first and second epistle, they also identify themselves as followers of Jesus. So they believe in a historical Jesus.
I believe in a historical Jesus. That doesn't mean I believe he rose from the dead. Try again.
In 1 Peter 1:3, Peter gives a blessing. He says, "Blessed be God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his great mercy caused us to be born again in a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead." So there we've got a mention of the resurrection in one of these letters.
Yes, by Peter, the one I very clearly put forth as risen Jesus patient zero. But even so, not a word about the nature of said resurrection.
We do, even though they're not going into a lot of detail about it, they do attest to belief in the resurrection attributed to these men.
So we agree. There are no details, and not even basic resurrection affirmation from James or John. Should we accept the forgeries for some reason?
Paulogia then suggests that social contagion originating with Peter could have convinced people of the resurrection, but this is just speculation.
By definition, a hypothesis is speculation that attempts to explain facts. We're 2 hours in, and I'm worried that the panel will never actually talk about whether the hypothesis sufficiently explains the existence of Christianity. Instead, they're just going to keep on assuming that the Bible can't be false.
Paulogia has presented no evidence for social contagion. Instead, the evidence we have from the Gospels...
See?
When the actual evidence we have from the relevant documents indicates it was not social contagion, it was personal encounter that convinced all these men. Thomas, who doubted what they were telling him, being the most notable example.
This is exhausting.
The claims by Paul, let me go ahead and start.
And these go quicker from here.
Yeah, they go quicker from here. There's not too much going on, but we'll go ahead and finish them out.
2 hours of complaining that I'm ignoring the Gospels. But as we start to get to the Gospels, not too much going on.
Stories about Jesus spread through person-to-person evangelism, with the focus on recruiting new followers rather than accurately transmitting historical events. Details were embellished or invented to eliminate obstacles to belief, and the narratives most successful at winning converts were repeated. The Jesus movement grew for many decades before the first Gospels were written, so scholars generally agree that it spread primarily through personal evangelism and word of mouth, rather than through written texts or formal institutions.
So there's not too much to respond here other than to say, cool story, bro. Cool.
This was the real moment I was destroyed.
Just briefly, so he says details were embellished or invented to eliminate obstacles to belief. Okay, there's no evidence of that. You can claim that, but you need to provide evidence for a claim if you want people to believe it.
I'm uncertain as to what evidence would look like to document conversations that weren't written down. But there are many examples in the written history. The authors of Matthew, Luke, and John changing Mark for clear apologetic purpose. There's all the apocryphal books, which felt free to invent and embellish, so clearly an early Christian thing to do. The escalations of Joseph of Arimathea come to mind, or maybe Matthew's edition of Guards at the Tomb, which even William Lane Craig agrees was polemical rather than historical.
The argument is that there was a anti-Christian polemic by the Jewish authorities which alleged that the disciples came and stole the body away at night while the guards slept. And Matthew is exercised to try to refute this widespread Jewish counter-explanation of the resurrection. It doesn't matter if the guard is fictional or not. The point is that this was the story that was being told at the time that Matthew wrote, in which he wants to refute.
If all this was happening in the written era, how much more easily would it have been happening in the wild, wild west of the oral tradition era? It's called a hypothesis because it's a proposal that well explains the data.
His persecution of Christians may well have caused him profound guilt and cognitive dissonance. This psychological distress, possibly resembling post-traumatic stress disorder, could have triggered a psychotic break, manifesting as a vision of the resurrected Jesus. Paul's subsequent conversion to Christianity may have served as a coping mechanism to resolve his inner turmoil, alleviate guilt, and find a new purpose in life.
I guess what kind of strikes me is just how implausible it is. It's really difficult to try to diagnose psychologically what's going on in someone who lived 2,000 years ago. That's a very difficult thing to do.
What you don't want to do is propose that someone 2,000 years ago might plausibly have been motivated by guilt. That would be a huge fallacy, and no one should ever do it.
A Joseph of Arimathea story doesn't seem too implausible. Like, it's one person, Joseph, who decided, hey, look, actually, I want to kind of give this guy, like, at least give him an honorable burial. He may be the Messiah. Like, I know we just crucified him and stuff, but he could be dealing with guilt. And so it just doesn't seem that implausible, to me at least.
It's so weird that earlier in the stream, Cameron thought that Joseph of Arimathea might change his mind about Jesus because he felt guilty. For Joseph, it doesn't seem implausible to Cameron. But when I suggested Paul might change his mind because he felt guilty, Cameron says,
I mean, you might as well just start postulating aliens coming down as well. Like, might as well throw some of that in here. Some aliens actually rose Jesus from the dead, or you know,
time
created
travel,
a twin, time travel. Yeah, you might as well just add in a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yes. Suggesting that a human changes their mind due to guilt is just the same as proposing aliens and time travelers. What a helpful and proportional response that is from the crew that is advocating ghosts and godmen.
These really complex hypotheses it's more challenging to affirm them over a more simple hypothesis like Jesus rose from the dead. Much simpler.
Yeah.
And there's less moving parts.
Occam's razor doesn't prefer an explanation with fewer moving parts. It's that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity.
The way Occam's razor works is you want to prefer the hypothesis that does not multiply entities beyond those that are needed to explain the observations, to explain the data.
See, Jimmy knows. Turning the ignition key, which sends an electrical signal from the battery to the starter motor, causing it to crank the engine. The crankshaft moving the pistons, creating the necessary compression for the fuel-air mixture in the cylinders to be ignited by spark plugs to start the combustion process, ultimately leading to the engine running, is much more complicated than saying, God started my car. But guess what? Until such time as you've established a God, you're multiplying entities. And even with an established God, involving him in explanations that don't require him would be beyond necessity.
In one sense, the idea there is no God is simpler because it proposes one less entity.
Everything in my 12 statements is mundane. People die. Bodies get disposed of. Followers leave when cults disband. People have grief experiences. People join false religions. Stories expand over time. People feel guilty and change their mind. The panel doesn't have an objection to any of these occurrences until you dare contradict their particular holy book. If you prefer fewer words, I could just replace my whole hypothesis with people were mistaken. That's 2 fewer words than Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus rose from the dead is way more complicated than people were mistaken. So everyone should prefer mine, right?
Paulogia just asserts that Paul had a non-veridical vision, meaning one that did not correspond to reality. That's what non-veridical means. But that's, you can assert that, but that's no different than simply asserting Paul had veridical vision.
That's correct. A non-veridical vision has the exact same explanatory power as a veridical vision, but a non-veridical one isn't multiplying entities, so it is to be preferred.
And in footnote 18, which he's got there in that second short paragraph, he cites Acts twice for Paul having visions, but elsewhere he dismisses what Acts says, even though when it disagrees with him. So this is more evidence of how he cherry picks the data.
Well, let's look at it. I list 3 primary sources, 2 from Galatians and 1 from 2 Corinthians, then a period, then the word additionally, meaning not primarily, then some places where it happens in Acts. I relegated them to a second sentence because I consider them to be less reliable. But excellent cherry-picking sleuthing, Jimmy.
So do we find any evidence that Paul felt guilty before Jesus appeared to him? Heck no, because the data is Paul was enthusiastic about killing Christians and was looking to do even more when Jesus appeared to him.
Are you under the impression that people can't feel guilty, be it consciously or subconsciously, about things they're doing enthusiastically? That's not how guilt works.
Paul met Peter and John, but they didn't see eye to eye.
Even though I agree that apologists sometimes mistakenly are quick to assume that Paul got lots of his doctrine from the Jerusalem apostles, which he uses language that tends to discount that idea.
Several decades later, Greek-speaking individuals who had never met Jesus or Peter began documenting these circulating stories about Jesus, the sayings attributed to him, and their interpretations of these narratives. The case is nearly ironclad that the Gospels are complex literary works shaped by various factors rather than straightforward historical accounts.
I wonder what he means by that and what his criteria is for having an ironclad case for something.
Well, I'm happy to say that the Gospels are, literary narratives that highlight certain things that Jesus did in order to bring out significance, like the way the way Matthew works. He portrays Jesus as a new Moses, through literary allusions back to Moses and the Exodus. But one thing I will note is that they didn't feel free, the authors of the Gospels didn't feel free to just make stuff up.
How could you possibly know that? You can't point in some parts of a document that you think are obviously correct, and then extrapolate to insist that nothing was made up. The most convincing lies have a kernel of truth. You're treating the books like they're all or nothing, and that's not the way historical documentation goes. Most of it's in the gray. At very least, the authors were willing to make editorial alterations each time Mark is copied mostly verbatim, but not quite. The Joseph of Arimathea variations come to mind.
Well, Mark is emphasizing that same perspective here, but notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't invent a saying and put it on Jesus's lips, even about one of the most controversial subjects in the first century church at this time. He doesn't make up a saying of Jesus to deal with it. So this contradicts Paulogia's thesis that the Gospels contain just made-up Jesus material.
Your case against my case is that the author of Mark had a chance to give Jesus a more definitive statement, and he didn't take that chance. Therefore, everything is true. First of all, part of what happened is that legends grew for decades, and I'm sure the gospel authors were being reasonably faithful to the oral tradition that was commonly accepted. You could only deviate from that so much. They likely wholeheartedly believed it too, but they were not in a position to know. I don't actually say they invented everything from scratch. I say it's complicated.
Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add on this one. I do want to reiterate, though, that I think Gavin early on when we first started this, he was saying that a lot of these facts seem unrelated to the resurrection. But what he's attempting to do is explain how Christianity began. So some of this is like this. That's the theory about the whole origins of Christianity as opposed to the facts surrounding Jesus' resurrection that apologists and conservatives usually point to. So that's why you see facts like or claims like number 11 here.
Cameron is the panel member paying attention.
Let's look at his claims and see how good they are. Well, so the first Christian martyr, which Paulogia has basically ignored, was James, son of Zebedee. He was killed around AD 43 by Herod Agrippa, and you can read about that in Acts chapter 12.
You'll recall that we already covered this as low confidence that it actually happened.
But actually, the evidence is that Paul was not killed by Nero.
Eusebius, Ecclesiastical History, Book 2, Chapter 25. Thus, publicly announcing himself as first among God's chief enemies, he, Nero, was led on to the slaughter of the apostles. It is therefore recorded that Paul was beheaded in Rome itself, and that Peter likewise was crucified under Nero. This account of Peter and Paul is substantiated by the fact that their names are preserved in the cemeteries of that place even to the present day. And Jimmy must like this source because he turns to it next.
Then we've got the case of James the Just that Paulogia mentions. Now, he was killed in AD 62.
The earliest and most reliable source about James's death is from 1st century Jewish historian Josephus with a matter-of-fact report. But that version doesn't help the panel's apologetic narrative rescue mission. So he's going to advocate instead for a 2nd century Christian rewriting with clearly legendary elements that the author simply could not have been present to witness.
And in his case, we have a 2nd century source. This is the 2nd century historian Hegesippus. You can find him quoted in Eusebius's Church History.
I once had a chat with Christian scholar Mike Licona about this very thing.
Since I don't take the Hegesippus and Clement accounts to be particularly reliable, do you think that I was somewhat disingenuous if I'm sticking only to the Josephus source? Like, do you feel like in these conversations I really should be linking to both of them if I don't take them as good?
I think Josephus' report is probably going to be the best just because it's an unsympathetic source and it's 1st century. Whereas, the others are going to be Christian sources. We don't know much about Hegesippus. Clement of Alexandria, again, he's not reliable at times. So, he's going to have lesser weight. But,
Paulogia seems stuck on martyrdom, no doubt because a lot of Christian apologists have overclaimed. We don't have evidence that all of the 12 or all of the 12 but John were martyred. So we don't want to overclaim on this. But martyrdom is not the only way of proving your sincerity. Sticking with your story just under lesser forms of persecution also indicates your sincerity.
I agree. Where is your evidence that an eyewitness other than Peter or Paul was out there sticking to their story?
And we have abundant evidence of early Christian leaders facing opposition and sticking to their story, thus indicating they were sincere.
Yeah, church leaders isn't the same as eyewitnesses. If you're claiming that eyewitnesses were sticking to their story, please demonstrate an eyewitness other than Peter or Paul sticking to their story.
Nothing more to add on that one. Let's go ahead and close it out. Let's get
last one. Woohoo!
Last one.
Centuries later, in 303 AD, Christianity was temporarily outlawed in Rome, but it gained legal protection 10 years later and soon became the Roman Empire's first official religion, marking its transformation toward the institution we know today.
Paulogia is ignoring cases where we know the law was enforced, like in Pliny the Younger's correspondence with the Emperor Hadrian, which is around 120 AD.
Nope, that's covered in number 11.
He reiterates his view on just Peter originated all of this. That contradicts the creed that we saw from 1 Corinthians 15, which lists multiple different appearances of Jesus, including to groups, one as large as 500.
That's correct. By definition, every naturalistic hypothesis will contradict the passage that says it was supernatural. If you refuse to entertain the hypothetical that this passage could be wrong, then there's no point whatsoever in you bothering evaluating alternative hypotheses. You're just philosophically committed to... Again, you'll notice that this creed isn't even one of Gary's facts to explain. That the panel is more credulous than Gary is damning.
And then he says that supplemental embellishments like the tomb, group appearances, and suffering of other witnesses are not facts, but merely story artifacts of the legendary development. Well, he can assert that, but that's just false.
If these were facts, Gary would include them as facts. He doesn't, and he's recently been called out by another Christian scholar for declaring too many things facts, not too few things.
These traditions of the tomb, the group appearances, the suffering of other witnesses are multiply attested.
They are not. Mark codified an oral tradition. Matthew, Luke, and John copied that and adapted it. That's collusion, not corroboration.
And it seems like a lot of it is just sort of hand-waving away the evidence. But, I mean, maybe a more accurate description is just cherry-picking. There's a lot of cherry-picking going on with this hypothesis, unfortunately.
Well, I'm glad that Paulogia had a good cherry harvest this year.
Let me know in the comments, where was I cherry picking? They seem to think this because the panel is assuming I'm relying on sources that I'm not. So they created their own narrative. Any brief summary of a topic is going to have ambiguities, so it's fair to make guesses. I'd say it's unfair to insist that said guesses must necessarily be accurate, but what do I know?
what do you guys think about this? I mean, obviously we have our opinions. We're Christians, we're apologists.
At the end of the day, none of the panelists were there to entertain a hypothetical scenario in good faith. Part of the hypothetical is the conceit that the Gospels are merely theologically motivated literature, and they spent virtually no time on that. Unless this, or any panel, is willing to entertain the hypothetical for the sake of discussion, then they're missing the point, and engaged in pure question-begging by definition. Remember, I'm not asking you to prefer my hypothesis because it's natural. I'm taking up Gary's challenge of putting forth a natural hypothesis that explains his facts, and then asking Christians to evaluate it side by side. Maybe that's too much to ask of an apologist.
But if you have a different opinion on what took place here, and if you want to defend Paul, feel free to do that in the comments.
Thanks for watching. This has been a long one. If you stuck it out this long, perhaps consider becoming a patron of the channel. I'd love to keep doing this, and support for as little as a few dollars a month is the only way I can. Appreciate you all. Thanks again for watching.
Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you in the next video. We'll have a lot more coming up very soon. So see you guys very soon. Later.
Later.